Good afternoon. Welcome for the latest episode about the Coalface. Today we're going to be talking about behind the headlines, an investigative journalist take on fraud investigations. Thank you for giving up your time. I know it's the first week after Christmas, so for people to show up, it's great. We had 150 registered for today, which is a great turnout. So thank you for making time for us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Arun Chauhan. I'm a lawyer. I run this law firm, Tenet. We specialise in investigations, disputes and compliance arising out of fraud and financial crime. Now, the aim of the At the Coalface sessions, these webinars, is to speak to people who are on the front line of dealing with fraud and financial crime. And today I'm really humbled, excited to have Andy Verity with us, who is the BBC's financial investigations correspondent, author of the book Rigged, and also the host of the Lowball tapes, which was on BBC Sounds, and much more. So, Andy, thank you for taking time to join us. Perhaps just a little introduction about yourself, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, sure. Let's see. I've been a journalist for more than 30 years now, actually, and I've been at the Beeb for 25. I started as personal finance correspondent. Through the crisis between 2005 to about 2013, I presented a thing called Wake Up to Money very early in the morning on Radio 5 Live. So had an interesting insight into all those events. And then since then, I've been economics correspondent for 10 years, including through COVID. And more recently, I got this gig as financial investigations correspondent, which was really formalizing what I've been doing for a while, because although you can report inflation and job figures and stuff as economics correspondent, there isn't actually a big news to report every day. So what I did was using that time to dig into stuff that I was interested in. First of all, manipulating interest rates, and then various other things like small businesses getting done over by banks' so-called support units or recovery departments, which weren't really what they said on the tin. And that led me to the whole sort of libel business. And then since I sort of developed it and started doing stuff for Panorama and various other things. And so it's still, for me, even after all this time, an exciting job to do. And also to meet people like the people attending this, who spend their lives chasing fraud down and trying to find justice. You know, in a way, it's a similar thing we do. It's all about trying to get some sort of measure of justice, whether it's exposing something that hasn't been exposed, or, you know, reporting the latest twist or turn in the post office scandal. So in a way, what I am is a muckraker in the old-fashioned sense.
Well, it's good to have a good muckraker on the show for today. So thank you for making time. So what we're going to try and do is the structure, if anyone who's joined at the Coalface before, is we cover 5 broad topics. We may not quite stay on them all the time. We might meander away, but we'll try and stick to the themes as best we can. We'll talk for about 45 minutes, leave a bit of time for a roundup and Q&A, and we'll send you on your way. So the 5 topics we're going to talk about, Andy's already started to give us an insight for about, you know, what interests Andy and myself about fraud investigations. How do we go about approaching, you know, uncovering the truth? We're going to talk about Rigged, the story. I'm going to lean in and talk a bit about whistleblowing with Andy and what's happened in terms of those involved in that story. And then we'll move on to talk about the obstacles facing investigative journalists when they try to unpick a story, or the kind of obstacles I've seen in my experience in investigating fraud. And then we'll look at tools used for investigations, what's similar about journalists, what's similar about the law. And hopefully we'll give you all something to take away, or something of use and interest, for giving up your hour to be with us. Now, the only housekeeping thing I have to do on a webinar is to mention that we've got motion censored lighting in the office. So for some reason, I haven't sussed out why, but at about 40 minutes in, when I've done these episodes before, it all goes dark. So I'll start waving my hand around like a crazy person, and the lights come back on, but we are still going. Right, so the first area, we've just started to talk about it actually, Andy, is about, you know, the interest in investigations. Now, I get asked why, you know, you go to do podcasts, or we get to do talks to other people. People ask me, you know, why you're a lawyer, why you're interested in fraud. And I've been dealing with fraud probably about 17 years, been a lawyer for about 22. And I always talk about Indiana Jones and Magnum PI. Never got the Ferrari, didn't keep the mustache. But I'm interested about the history. I'm interested about what's the true state of affairs. I quite like criminology. I want to know why good people can do bad things. What about you? What is it that is taking you from like that economics into this kind of investigative, kind of the financial side? What is the thing that grabs you so much?
Well, yeah, I mean, in a way, it is history. It's a kind of an interesting contemporary history. So when you do daily news, it's all very shallow. Yesterday's chip paper is the expression you use in newspapers. You write something, and then the next day it's kind of forgotten. And it's also not very rigorous. And you get the sense, things like the financial crisis, suddenly it's revealed how much you didn't know about for the last 10 years and all the things you weren't being told about. Well, in that case, the vulnerabilities of the banks and all that kind of stuff. So I've always had a sense that I'm skating in the shallows when I'm doing daily news. And a lot of news, let's face it, is quite superficial. It's in a way, it has a role as the first draft of history. But the second draft of history should go a level deeper. So it is a sense that there's lots of stuff there which just is never uncovered, and it's rare to find the evidence to be able to uncover it. So I mean, there are things like, for example, everybody suspects that horse racing is fixed, but it's really rare to get the evidence to prove it and be able to say it on TV. And the buzz in investigative journalism is when you find that evidence and you think, now I can say that, now I can show it. And it's also what it illustrates. So although it may seem to be unimportant because it's just one story, often it illustrates something more broadly about what's going on, the times we live in, etc. So I guess it's the buzz of finding out, and it's also the chance to do an expose, to restore accountability, and to have a kind of, in a way, it's the best of journalism. Some people will say the only journalism, the only kind of proper journalism is investigative journalism, the only kind where you're not just rehashing something, but you're actually finding stuff out. And I also think that's where you're really doing the public a service. And so it's a kind of I want to do some good with my career before I retire, and this is the way I can do it.
It's interesting. I really like that concept of the second kind of drafting or digging into history, because we only know what we're told at the material time. Yes. And then many years later, things tend to come out to the surface because people are less concerned about risk and things like that. But when what happens on our desk is we'll get someone who will contact us, and they'll say, I suspect dishonesty, be it in a business context, be it in a personal context, whatever the context. And there's two things I've realised, and I've wrote it down just to make sure I get this right, which is, firstly, is that I've got to be very open-minded. So I've got to believe that the unbelievable might have happened. And, the example I think everyone will think about now is the post office. But on the flip side, I recognise something might look like fraud, but there might be a logical explanation for it. And again, the post office is another example, just looking through the lens from the Postmasters General. So when you get something that is interesting you, that buzz of I might be onto discovering something here, how do you remain objective? Because we have to try and remain objective.
Well, the truth is that you're on a hunt. That's the truth about it. When you're doing investigative journalism, it's like being on a hunt. And in a way, to sort of pretend that you're constantly, evenly holding the scales of justice and weighing up two points of view is just not how it really works. You get evidence given to you by one side. It's more like being a fraud lawyer, I think. You get evidence given to you by one side, you dig into it, you check it out, you work out whether it's a run or whether you can do anything with it or not. And then when you've got everything lined up, you then go to the other side and you give them a chance to respond and say, what do you think? A lot of the time, particularly when you're up against an organization, I did a story recently about Jaguar Land Rover and Tata Group, an organization that's not used to being criticized. They don't want to say anything on the record. So sometimes you're necessarily really getting most of your information from one side, but that doesn't mean you're not objective, because you try to get some objectivity in by putting the right of reply. And in a way, that's why the right of reply process is so important. It can also act as a corrective if you've got something wrong. So I think most of the time you talk to your sources quite a lot for days, weeks, months, and you may not talk to the other side until quite close towards the end. So but what you must do is you must be prepared to have your theories dislodged. So that's the real objectivity for me. A scientist doesn't form no theory. He doesn't say, well, electricity might be like this or it might be like that. I'm not going to come down on either side. He puts forward his hypothesis, what he really thinks. And then if some evidence comes the other way when he's experimenting, he has to redevelop his theories. And I think that's how it should be with journalism too.
And when you start that process, so where you're, maybe we'll explain right of reply to people that understand it in a moment, but when you start that process and you get a story, I remember a barrister at the QC KC now said to me, no matter how complicated the fraud claim we're dealing with, we've got to distill this onto 2 pages of paper. So we know the real substance of what we're looking at, and then we build it out from there. Is that a similar approach to you? Do you just think, right, well, if I'm going to be commissioned to run with something, I've got to distill this down and then build it out?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, really with fraud, especially, a lot of the game is just finding simple ways to explain it. And in a way, that's what much of the time stands between the public knowing things and an industry knowing them. So, for example, the banking industry knew what it was selling businesses when it sold them interest rate hedging products. The businesses didn't really have much of a clue. So the battle there is to cross that, in the gap between what one party knows and what the other party knows. That's often where the fraud takes place, isn't it? So the fraud victim doesn't really know what they're getting into. The fraudster really does. So a lot of the game is crossing that bridge between what the fraudster knows and what the public knows and explaining it well. So when you're pitching a story and trying to get somebody interested in doing it, whether it's the TV news or the radio or Panorama or File on 4, you must simplify it. And that's a lot of the mental effort, is to simplify it. And so much information comes at you with a fraud investigation, as I'm sure lawyers are familiar. I copy lawyers' ways of trying to stay sane. So, for example, having a chronology, the timeline is absolutely essential. And these days you can do timelines and embed your evidence in the timeline. So you just have to click and you sort of lay out the whole story. And then not only does that make you feel more relaxed, you stop panicking about losing track of stuff, but also it suggests stuff. You think, okay, well, that happened there and that happened there. So who made that happen? Or, and you could sort of draw inferences and new lines of inquiry from your timeline.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, from the lawyer's point of view, when we look at that, kind of uncovering the truth, we'll have a client come to us and say, we think supply chain, there's an issue here, or there's an employee that's been up to no good there. But before we can go off and make any allegations, we've got regulatory obligations. And I know we'll talk about regulation and how strong or not strong that could be later. But we have to be satisfied that we can make an allegation of fraud as a lawyer, and that's got to be relatively objective. And we'll look at documents and we'll look at evidence. How, from your point, and obviously you've been working with the BBC for a long time, and they'll hold the standards. That verifying the veracity of a story, what takes you to that tipping point where you feel satisfied? When do you say, okay, I feel confident enough that we can stand by the story?
Well, you need something really strong. I mean, it's about the strength of the evidence, really, as it is for a lawyer. And for using the F word, as we call it, to actually say fraud, this is a fraud, you do need to have evidence of dishonesty. So quite often I'll report the BBC has uncovered evidence of X rather than has uncovered X. And that is a slightly lower burden of proof in order to be able to support that in, say if someone were to bring a defamation claim. So that's one thing you can do. But I think the answer to your question is, like, in order to use the F word, you do have to have a pretty strong evidence. So a lot of the work is a search for evidence. And if someone's just saying it, we'll be reluctant to repeat it unless we can get some sort of documentary, audio or video evidence to support it. And that's why the evidence is so exciting, because it opens the gate. It opens the path to actually be able to do a proper expose.
Yeah, and I think that leads me back to the Magnum PI comment. The idea, it is the investigation. I love the part of actually trawling through the documents. I like being on that front line, but it still intrigues me, which is, I guess, why there's a synergy. But the other thing I think about, though, is, we'll get the start, you pull the thread of the story, or you pull the thread of the case, or someone saying, well, something odd's going on here. And I will be thinking about, right, okay, what's the source of that information? Sometimes it can be kind of a routine compliance process, or it can be a transaction, and something stands out as odd. but I'm thinking about who's the informant, where's it come from, and I was just thinking about it in the context of people coming up to you with stories saying, "I think I've seen something which is wrong here, and I want you to look into it." How do you get comfortable with kind of the motivation of an informant? How do you feel they're not trying to, further their own means in a game which you're not even playing in or part of or know about?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, you use your judgment and your experience, of course. And how do you get comfortable? Answer is you talk to people a lot and you are constantly assessing whether you think it's credible. I mean, it's interesting in the case, for example, of whistleblowers, because
Yeah.
with whistleblowers, some people call themselves whistleblowers and they aren't really. They've just fallen out with their employer or their boss. They've had a hard time at work and they may have brought an industrial tribunal claim, and they'll try to claim their whistleblowers in order to support their claim. But you have to have a degree of skepticism about it because it might actually be part of a wider fight rather than actually all about the whistleblowing. But equally, there are other whistleblowers who, when you've heard their story and you've heard them tell it enough and you've sort of, pushed on certain points, it becomes convincing. So that was the case, for example, in a story I did just before Christmas about Jaguar Land Rover whistleblower, a mechanical
Yes.
engineer. Yeah, so I did this story just before Christmas. Said, guy, he's 30 years old and he spots bits snapping off the car while he's testing them. He's a mechanical engineer, raises it internally, moves on, resigns, goes to another job. But of course, it's in the car industry, and it's for another outfit for Jaguar Land Rover this time earlier this year. And he had been working for its sister company, Tata Group. And then he went on Reddit and blew the whistle effectively on Reddit after he saw an accident with the car he'd been working on, and tried to tell people, look, it's not safe for your family to get into this car, and then got sacked from Jaguar Land Rover. Now, with that, you could say, okay, it's just a grudgeful ex-employee who did something he shouldn't have. But actually, he had all kinds of evidence to show me, which convinced me, yes, he's not talking about nothing. He had pictures of the bits that snapped off while he'd been testing them.
Right.
So
Okay.
that's when you sort of take a closer interest and you gather all you can to support it. Then you go and pitch it to your editor and say, look, I really think this is a story worth telling. So yes, you do. It's an iterative process is the answer. It's getting to know someone, and a large part of investigative journalism as well, apart from doing timelines and the excitement of being handed a flash drive or coming across a document, coming across something you didn't know, is trust. The real thing is convincing people to part with information which they may have acquired and may carry risk for them to part with. But generally the motivation for it is, look, this would be a good thing. You don't want this stuff to stay silent, do you? You don't want it to stay covered up. You want this to come out because it shouldn't be covered up. So it's generally actually quite a righteous motivation that people have and that I try to use to convince them to do it. Come on, this should come out.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things I think about when you get that tip off, that lead, is, what have they got to lose in this process? And if the stakes are quite high for them, there's a degree of assurance for me. And that's that, because I think, we'll talk about this later, but the human element in a lot of these frauds, or those who are giving us information,
Yes.
it's not often told enough. And we hear about the kind of corporate maturity and the reaction of the large organizations to these types of issues. Now, it kind of feeds in to that little book on the shelf windowsill
This one.
behind you.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do a plug for Rigged. And,
Okay, plug. There it is.
hey,
Rick, this came out last year.
yeah,
Thanks for allowing me to do that. I mean, you can hear the story for free if you find the Lowball tapes online, which is a Radio 4 series I did. But this is a basically expanded version of that, and I can tell you, it is actually the most shocking story I've ever come across, that I've ever covered. It's the sort of story you find at one of these once in a career.
right.
And I've done my best to convey in it the excitement of the story, of finding out about it, and also just the shock that this can happen. So just to give you a quick précis of the
Yeah,
story.
please do.
Yeah, thanks. So let me take you on a little trip down memory lane very briefly. I'm going to play just a couple of clips. Is that all right, Aaron, if I play
Yeah,
just
let's
a
see if
couple of
let's
TV
see if we can
clips?
get it to work. It should be fine.
So let's see if we can do this, and then I'll get to the clips. So you may remember this. So remember the crisis, financial crisis, 2008. Rigged goes right back to 2007. It spans 16 years, effectively, from 2007 until the present. In the crisis, what everybody knew that Gordon Brown had intervened and all the governments had intervened to bail out the banks and spent huge amounts doing so. But what they were less aware of was a thing called LIBOR. Now, LIBOR is basically benchmark for interest rates. It is to interest rates what the FTSE 100 is to share prices, effectively.
Yeah.
The London Interbank Offered Rate keeps track of the cost of borrowing cash between the banks, or did for most of the past 35 years. And it was in the crisis, though, all the banks were lying about the cost of borrowing cash, because when the credit crunch hit in 2007, the cost of borrowing effectively shot up, but the banks didn't really want to admit what they were really paying to borrow. Now, certain people blew the whistle on this, including a guy at Barclays called Peter Johnson, and it sort of bubbled up to the authorities. But when they investigated it, they realized that the sort of fraud that he was blowing the whistle on, where people were massively understating the interest rates they were paying to borrow cash, that sort of fraud was actually leading to the top. It implicated the top of the financial establishment, central banks and governments. And they started pursuing instead a different kind of so-called fraud, a much smaller kind of so-called fraud, which was manipulating LIBOR by traders, making requests for LIBOR to be submitted high or low. Now, just to explain it a little bit, 16 banks every day put in an estimate of what they think it will cost them to borrow cash, the interest rate they think they'll have to pay to borrow cash, and then they take an average of that, and that's LIBOR. So sometimes traders who had big positions linked to LIBOR would say, could you put it in high or low? Now, the thing is that they didn't mean put it in fraudulently. They meant choose from a range of accurate rates which one will be commercially best for the bank. But when the regulators came to investigate it and found themselves it quite unappealing to go after central banks for fraud, instead they decided to go after the traders. And eventually in 2012, you had this.
Tonight, Barclays is engulfed by a new banking scandal. The bank is given record fines of £290 million for lying about the interest rate it paid on loans. The chief executive, Bob Diamond, is to waive his bonus, but he's facing calls to resign.
If Bob Diamond had a shred of shame, he would resign. He hasn't. So if the Barclays board has any little backbone, they'll sack him.
We'll be revealing how the scandal will involve other big banks in the UK and overseas. Also tonight.
So I'm just going to stop it there and then go to the end of this report. This was the evidence of traders rigging that the public heard at that time.
Of everything the world produces, global GDP. Now, a tiny difference in the LIBOR or Euribor rate could determine whether a bank like Barclays and other banks would make a big profit or a loss on these massive deals. So, Barclays traders had a powerful incentive to try to manipulate these rates in collusion with traders from other banks. This is what Barclays traders said in emails when their counterparts elsewhere asked them to rig the market. Always happy to help, said one. Done for you, big boy, and I owe you big time. I'm opening a bottle of Bollinger.
But then here's the thing. It seems like it's all about the traders, but then a week later, this came out.
Well, in a moment, we'll hear from our deputy political editor, James Landale. But first, let's go to Canary Wharf and join our business editor, Robert Peston. Robert, I mentioned these documents that have been released by Barclays just now. How significant are they going to be?
Well, the first thing to mention, George, is that this is a very, very difficult time in terms of the relationship between the Bank of England and Barclays. I disclosed earlier today that the governor of the Bank of England, Sir Mervyn King, effectively bundled Bob Diamond out the door because he spoke to Marcus Aegis, Barclays chairman, and he said to him that he felt it was right for Mr. Diamond to go. Now, against that background, we've had the explosive publication of a contemporaneous note taken by Bob Diamond of a conversation he had with with Paul Tucker, the deputy governor of the Bank of England, at the height of the banking crisis in 2008. And this note will be seen as evidence that Mr. Tucker was encouraging Barclays to understate its borrowing costs. It says that there was widespread concern in Whitehall that Barclays appeared to be paying a high cost to borrow because that was seen as evidence that the bank was weak. And Mr. Diamond says that Mr. Tucker was encouraging Barclays to publish lower borrowing costs. Now, the significance of that is that it was last week that Barclays was severely punished by regulators for understating its borrowing costs. So the Bank of England appeared to be encouraging Barclays for doing the very thing that it was punished for.
So you're like,
Andy,
yes,
just to jump in there, maybe.
Yes.
So what was essentially happening at the time was it was to reduce the LIBOR rate. So a higher LIBOR rate would indicate a lower credibility on creditworthiness, so a higher risk on lending. So
Yes.
by having a lower rate, people were more assured. So essentially what was happening was a group of banks, or lots of banks, or the entire industry, trying to suppress the reality of an economic crisis. Is that a good way of putting it?
That's right. I mean, in a way, it's simpler. All the banks were lying about the interest rates they were paying to borrow cash. They didn't want to tell the truth because it would have made them look weak. So they were all understating it, and they were later fined for it. But what Robert Peston is referring to here is evidence that came out after they were fined, that Barclays put out there, showing that actually that understatement of rates, which was called lowballing, where they were understating the cost of borrowing cash, that fraudulent understatement was encouraged and indeed instructed by the Bank of England. Now, the MPs at the time had an inquiry into that, and there was various testimony and everything focused on the traders, and they forgot all about the evidence of instructions from the top, from the Bank of England, to put in fraudulently low LIBOR rates, and it all sort of went away. And then you had a trader prosecution.
A millionaire city trader is jailed for 14 years for banking fraud in the first case of its kind in Britain. A jury found Tom Hayes guilty of rigging LIBOR, the interbank lending rate, a scandal which has cost banks billions in fines. The 35-year-old claimed the practice was widespread and he was being made a scapegoat, but investigators have welcomed his conviction.
So Andy, could we, as I say, maybe we could stop screen sharing now, just to keep us in time.
Sure.
The Tom Hayes situation, though, he's one of two, isn't he, with Carlo Palumbo, that have got permission to appeal to the Supreme Court. I think that's happening in March of this year. And what's your take on what's happening there? Because I think what's happened, well, maybe you can enlighten people about what has happened in the US and where we are now, what could happen in relation to the Supreme Court.
Well, the thing is that we had these rumours of Bank of England involvement, and what I was just coming to was after Tom Hayes was, that's okay, no, what after Tom Hayes was jailed, they had this big scandal. There were rumours of instructions from the top that are instructing lowballing, this fraudulent LIBOR rate. But those were sort of swept under the carpet. The MPs heard about them, and then they sort of said, the Bank of England said, no, we didn't instruct any false rates, and it was all sent away. And then Tom Hayes went to jail, and I started taking an interest in his trial because that was one of the few trials that they'd had after the financial crisis of a banker. And it was one of the few trials of fraud for a banker. The charge was conspiracy to defraud, which actually has a very low burden of proof. You only have to show that there's an agreement to do something, not that something actually took place. And I became suspicious at the trial at some of the evidence. It looked like people were offering each other lattes and sushi and pints of beer for manipulating interest rates. And you start thinking, but hold on, why would somebody pay six figures, do something fraudulent, risking criminal jeopardy for a colleague just on the basis of, I'll have a coffee out of it? It doesn't make sense. So I started looking further into it, and eventually I got given the holy grail of the LIBOR scandal, which is a tape which was proving what Robert Peston had said there, namely that there had been an instruction from the Bank of England to Barclays to lower its LIBOR rates to a fraudulent rate. And if I could just give you a quick blast of it, won't take a second.
Let's see if it comes through.
Bottom line is, you're going to absolutely hate this, but we've had some very serious pressure from the UK government and the Bank of England about pushing our LIBORs lower.
So I'll push them below a realistic level of where I think I can get money.
PJ, I'm completely 100% on your side on this. You and I agree that it's the wrong thing to do. I am as reluctant as you are, and these guys have just turned around and said, just do it.
Now, the really shocking thing about that, Aaron, is just that that tape was hidden throughout 9 criminal trials of the traders for rigging interest rates. So while they were being prosecuted for asking for tiny shifts in LIBOR of perhaps 1/100 of a percentage point, 1 basis point, this instruction, which was much larger and resulted in genuinely fraudulent rates, came from central banks. That was suppressed, that information, throughout the trials. Now, if you're struggling to follow this, it's a lot of information. I know it's quite dense. It's laid out very simply and clearly in the book and also in the lowball tapes. But the essence of it is, for me, was just the shock of learning that there'd been this sort of hidden scandal, that the truth about the LIBOR scandal hadn't been what the regulators had told us. It hadn't been what the banks had paid $15 billion in fines for. It had actually been, the whole story was completely upside down.
Yeah.
I struggled to convince colleagues of this until the US courts decided the same thing at the beginning of 2022 and said, yeah, actually the case against all the traders was not true. And we may now have the same happen here. In March, there's going to be a Supreme Court hearing. Now, if that goes in favour of the traders, it again confirms the story. The case against the traders was bunk. And actually, the real story, all the evidence pointing to the top, has been covered up.
And it's interesting. So we know from a lawyer's perspective, if you get permission to appeal to the Court of Appeal or get permission from the Court of Appeal to go to the Supreme Court, that means there is something here to look at. It's not just ticking a box to give someone another last say. There is something substantive to look at. And
yes,
there's so much to this story that I think intrigues anyone who listens to the lowball tapes, which I say will circulate from BBC Sounds or reads the book. But I want to talk about whistleblowing in a moment. But there's something here about self-regulation. So what I picked up was the setting of the LIBOR rate was done by these 16 banks. You had PJ at Barclays, you had others, and they were some good people trying to do the right thing by setting a genuine rate at which they could borrow money at.
Yes.
But it all spelled out that it was self-regulation. There wasn't anyone verifying externally that that's a fair rate from what I could see. But
yes,
there were regulators obviously around. There are regulators involved with the banking industry. So we've had other episodes here where we've talked about trust not being a control, but culture can help in terms of utilizing trust as part of a process to get things right and do the right thing. But the doing the right thing is sometimes ends up with people doing the right thing for them or for their self-interest or their group interests.
yes.
So I guess my question, or I'm like kind of humble, rationally honest, but what was the answer here? If self-regulation didn't work and regulation didn't work, how could this have been stopped anyway if both of those aspects weren't really doing their job?
Well, it's in a way, this is a story of a blame game. So when we look at what the courts have now ruled and that the Supreme Court may rule, they may say that, astonishingly, what banks paid $15 billion of fines for, and which led to 9 criminal trials on both sides of the Atlantic, was not actually wrong at all. What was called a fraud was not a fraud, but just normal commercial practice. Could you please put the LIBOR high today? I've got a position that could benefit from a high LIBOR. Didn't mean lie. It meant there's a range of prices. There's never just one true price. There's a range of prices. Someone's offering 3.14% to lend 500 million US dollars one day. Someone's offering 5.15. There's a narrow range, just a few percentage points apart. But what it shows, unfortunately, is that if the US authorities decide something's wrong, they can call commercial practice fraud and pursue people. Now, you would have thought the banks would say, hang on, no, we're going to argue with this. We don't want to pay the fine. We're gonna argue the merits of the case and say, look, no, this was normal commercial practice. But they don't. And this is the really unsettling thing. The banks would rather pay the fines and give the US Department of Justice some bodies to prosecute than they would argue the merits of the case. It makes it go away. They get assurances that no senior executives will be pursued, and they make sure that whoever they throw under the bus, or their lawyers throw under the bus, namely hand over the evidence with which to prosecute to the Department of Justice, that they don't know anything in Century that might implicate senior management. It's a very cynical practice, and I think it should unsettle us all. Banks make accusations of fraudulent conduct go away by paying fines they secretly don't agree with, but shareholders pay the fines, not the executives paying the fines, and then handing over some bodies to be prosecuted, even though they might secretly think that the whole case is misconceived.
And it kind of lends itself to what's happening on the landscape now. Now, obviously, since the financial crisis and other corporate failures where fraud's been involved, the landscape here on legislation is changing. We're going to have the failure to prevent fraud offence that comes in from September next year under the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, and you have a wider kind of sense of attribution, this identification principle that senior managers can cause organisations to be culpable for committing fraud.
Yeah.
But when you and I spoke just before we started today, before everyone else joined, you talked about this sense of fraud has been decriminalised, and I just want to get your sense of, well, with this legislation coming in, with a real push to try and have a gold standard in the UK about preventing fraud, what's your take on that development?
Well, I mean, I think it's a great development, and this has been pushed for by some campaigners against bank misconduct who feel there's a lack of accountability at the top. You look at the LIBOR scandal, you look at so-called Forex manipulation, any other of these things that banks have been fined for, you haven't really seen senior executives held accountable. The senior managers regime may occasionally dock a bonus, but actually it's only really been used in one instance, Jez Staley, who was fined for trying to unmask a whistleblower, allowed to keep his job. It was only years later that we found out he'd been misleading Barclays board, according to Barclays board, about his close acquaintance with Jeffrey Epstein, and he was booted out. Now that all stinks to high heaven. It should be that there are mechanisms to prevent people with those sorts of associations attaining those senior roles, to prevent, to make sure that senior executives are held accountable. Now, the great thing about it is, if you look back at the health and safety example, when they introduced a similar thing for failure to prevent there, in theory, the chief executives of all these construction companies were terrified that they'd be prosecuted. But it really concentrated minds, and almost overnight, health and safety in construction workplaces was transformed. The number of deaths dropped, etc. They didn't even have to prosecute anyone. So I think if they have a genuine threat of prosecution for senior executives, if fraud goes on under their bank, you start to clean up the city a little bit. But the problem I can see, to your point, Aaron, is that they might argue about whether it's fraud or not. And that's what the lawyers will do. And if you look at the history of some of the big scandals, like, well, you could say mis-selling of payment protection insurance. What is that but fraud? It's, of course, it's, you've misled someone with a view to gain. Well, that mis-selling is really fraud. The banks lobbied for it not to be called fraud. It was called mis-selling. Instead, mis-selling has no meaning in law. It's really a fraud scandal. Similarly, with interest rate hedging product mis-selling, that was called mis-selling. Or more recently, car finance mis-selling. Arguably, that's all fraud. So it may just shift the argument, taking a pessimistic view, that instead of arguing about whether an executive knew anything about something, you just argue about whether it's fraud or not.
Yeah, and I think it's good because if you look at, I think, Schedule 12 to the Economic Crime Corporate Transparency Act, it goes through maybe 5-6 pages of legislation which will now be deemed to be fraud, and there is a real wide range.
Right.
Back to rigged though, and maybe more in a general sense that you've got Peter Johnson, whistleblowers, people who good sense. I think you've written in the book a good sense of right and wrong. There's two things that jumped out at me when I was reading the aspects of the book, I guess, and it's one, you really try and lend yourself to giving colour and vision to the human story of those involved, the real impact on the people who have suffered as a result of these wider kind of economic crisis, these frauds. And maybe just talk a little bit maybe about why that's important to you. But also, if a whistleblower or a potential whistleblower read rigged, I'd expect they'd sit there and go, well, I'm not going to speak up because, God, look what could happen. I mean, what's your take on whistleblowing and that human story, everything that's about it?
I mean, Peter Johnson, was the guy who originally blew the whistle on the whole business of lowballing that I was describing earlier, where all the banks were understating the interest rates. Without him, there may never have been a scandal, and yet he ended up being prosecuted for it. So yes, it's a massive discouragement. It's an illustration of how banks can defend the heights, the executives, and then choose to dump on the whistleblower rather than listening to the issues. And similarly with Jaguar Land Rover, they didn't say to the mechanical engineer, okay, thanks for letting us know about that. We hadn't realized it was that bad. We care about customer safety. No, we better do something about it. Even reward the guy for bringing it up, because no one wants down the line for these cars to be crashing. That's no good for anyone's reputation. I think what you have, unfortunately, at the moment is the instinct of the corporation and indeed the government institution, whether it's the post office or Barclays Bank or the regulators, the instinct is always to conserve to protect the organization upon which you depend. So you're drawing your living from the post office, and you're drawing a very nice living from it. You're going to do everything you can to prevent the reputation from being defamed. And unfortunately, when people see a whistleblower, I liken it to a sort of autoimmune disorder. The whistleblower is actually the good bacteria. They're saying, look, there's something going wrong here. You need to sort it out. But instead of saying, okay, thanks, let's think about that, the instinct is to crush those whistleblowers. And they end up with often their lives ruined, their mental health. They struggle to sleep. They may lose their career. They may lose their families' mental and physical health. And it's really unacceptable that people who are really motivated by a sense of righteous indignation, no, this shouldn't be happening. We shouldn't be putting passengers at risk. We shouldn't be defrauding people. That those people who have the guts to stand up and speak out about it are put in such horrible jeopardy. I think there are whistleblower provisions that say if you raise something in the public interest, this is the Public Interest Disclosure at Work Act, 1998, that you should be protected from employer retaliation. But they don't work. They don't work because as a whistleblower, you have to prove that that was the reason you were sacked and no other. So what do the lawyers say at tribunal? Expensive lawyers hired by your employer say, oh, no, it wasn't for that reason. It was for another reason. And in fact, I think it's something like 96% of the cases, whistleblowers don't win. So the answer to your question is, in a way, don't do it. Don't blow the whistle. And where would we be then? The US authorities know that most of their cases that they bring against corporate malfeasance is from whistleblowers. Without the whistleblowers, they would be nowhere. They reward their whistleblowers by giving them 10% of any fine, which you could argue is maybe too much. It's crazy. Some people, there's one guy I know who was a whistleblower on UBS tax evasion, a guy called Bradley Birkenfeld, who was sent to jail and then later received $100 million from the US authorities for his whistleblowing. That's a crazy one.
It's a crazy one, but it's an avenue that this country may go down. We know, we met at a Whistleblowers UK event, and you may be regretting that now. I don't know, but there is this push for the office, an independent office of the whistleblower, isn't there? Where you'll have a government body that will independently investigate whistleblowing reports. So that might be something good for the future. Now, you talk about these kind of obstacles that a whistleblower faces, that the organisation will try and suppress it, say they were dismissed for other reasons. I've seen there was the solicitor recently fined for trying to suppress a tax correspondent about Nadeem Zahawi and his tax affairs, and he's been fined £50,000 plus £260,000 of costs for trying to suppress evidence coming out. What kind of obstacles have you faced on investigations?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's that. In that case, it's Dan Needle who brought it against Nadeem Zahawi, and that's a real battle royal, because Dan Needle was trying to expose what Nadeem Zahawi was up to, and Nadeem Zahawi used lawyers to try and effectively suppress it. The answer is, unfortunately, in this country, we don't really have a protection like they do in the States of the First Amendment. And in libel law, the burden of proof is on you, the journalist. So basically, if someone can prove that what you said is defamatory, and it may still be accurate, but if they can prove that it's defamatory, you then have to prove that it's justified, namely true. So all the burden of proof shifts to the journalist. And that, I think, is one reason why we don't have as much stuff come out as comes out in the States. We don't have incentives for whistleblowers. And also, as a journalist, you have to fight really hard, and you have to have the comfort of a big legal team and people signing off right up to the top, in order to do the difficult stuff. In the States, you don't get past first base bringing a defamation suit without proving that it's damaged you commercially. So I think that the legal framework needs changing, and it would be great if we had a system a bit more like the States, where you couldn't get rich people. You know, Jimmy Savile and Robert Maxwell both had something in common. They both issued writs at the drop of a hat when journalists tried to write about them, and they took advantage of the way the system is biased against. So we didn't hear about Jimmy Savile until he couldn't sue because he was dead. We didn't really hear the full extent of his crime. Similarly with Robert Maxwell. And you also have SLAPS. I'm sure you know about SLAPS. What does it stand for again? It's something about pre-action protocol, but basically it's a way of, now they're now reforming that, which I think is a good thing, but that enabled people like Roman Abramovich to sue Catherine Belton, the journalist who'd alleged that he was induced by Putin to buy Chelsea. Now that landscape is shifting. In the end, that case was settled, and Catherine Belton agreed to put a more detailed explanation in her book. But it's hard as a journalist because they can sue not just your organization, they can also sue you personally. So sometimes when you're really, really sort of reaching with the story, you could actually have your house on the line. They could try to go after your house and go after you personally. Now, I know that the BBC wouldn't let that happen and that they'd throw their backing behind me. But for smaller journalists in smaller organizations, well, they can be bullied by money into not saying things.
That's, I mean, I'll touch on confidentiality in a moment. I mean, you may not like me for bringing it up, but I mean, you get various kind of threats or counter threats in terms of fraud investigations, or will come back at your client for X or Y. I've had the physical threats. I've had the knock at the door at 6:30 in the morning where someone's come and left a letter for me, basically naming my wife and kids and saying, we know where you live, and they signed it off with their name. They didn't care. It was a client got caught up with a criminal gang in a procurement issue. You've had. Did
you try to report that, Aaron?
I was spent 4 hours at the police station on a Saturday. It was an experience, but
did it go anywhere?
No, it didn't go anywhere. I think they had a word with the individual, and that was it. And I did meet with the individual in the Court of Appeal of all places, saying, well, you were trying to serve something at my home address, so I wanted to let you know that we should be equal. And that was his handshake and talk to me. So you've got to be, I'm pretty small, I'm only 5'6", but you've got to still puff your chest out and hold, be confident when you get out there with these things. But you've had you've had one run in on it who made the press. What was that? Just for a bit of life.
I could play you a clip of it if I could find it. But yes, one of the highlights of my career was we found out in 2018 that the mayor of Odessa had used money which was of questionable origin to buy a flat in Marylebone, which was put in his daughter's name. And we found out all kinds about his background in a Ukrainian mafia gang. His name's Gennady Trakhanov. He's still mayor of Odessa and now hailed as a hero for standing up to the Russians, although he actually has a Russian passport. But anyway, we went to see him in 2018 between Skripal and the war in Ukraine. We went there challenging whether he'd been using London to launder dirty money. And I called out in Ukrainian, "Cheve korumpovny," with a camera running. "Are you corrupt?" Which next thing I knew, I was falling to the floor and something was quite painful going on between my legs. One of his thugs had basically kicked me in the nether regions and I'd gone down, and I came up and said to camera, "Someone's just kicked me in the groin," which turned into one of my highlights of my TV career. It sort of went viral. But I mean, I've been advised by all colleagues now, if I go into a similar situation, to make sure I wear a cricket box.
Yeah, well, it's good advice, isn't it? Maybe one for everyone in that type of risk approach. And yes. I know with Reed, you got a flash drive which gave you a lot of these recordings, which is the expose. We see situations where confidentiality is claimed to stop us looking at material if we're investigating a fraud. And there's various things. If lawyers are involved in that confidential material, we can get around it through something called the iniquity exception. We can use confidentiality rings. But how have you faced it as a journalist where you've got confidentiality being let's say laboured at you, that you can't use this material? How, as a journalist, how do you get around that type of situation?
Well, we are. I mean, there are exemptions to most things for things in the public interest. So, you know, if you can show, for example, that there's evidence of criminality, then that busts apart, or evidence of dangers to public safety, that busts apart any non-disclosure agreements. But it is hard, particularly where, for example, you might have someone who's left an employer, there's been a settlement, and then there's an NDA clause. They may feel that they can't talk to you, even though they really feel that the public should know something. So in those circumstances, you go and you talk to the internal BBC lawyers, the editorial policy, and take a view as to whether you can put the evidence out there. And you also take a view as to whether it would get your source into trouble much of the time. Yeah. So, you know, you have to think about source protection. Because the last thing you want is someone who's trying to help the public getting in trouble because they gave you information. So it's a lot to do with protecting your sources. And it's funny because my inclination is to be open. I think, you know, to be democratic is to be open, not to hide things. And it shouldn't be that money can buy silence. But you equally have to protect people, and therefore often with an investigation, you're keeping it under wraps and it's all quite hush-hush until you bring it out, partly to ensure that it comes out with the full impact, but also to protect people.
It's important to find that balance. I think that idea, though, the kind of editorial policy and about a public interest is so helpful, because otherwise we just won't get close to that freedom of speech, which is so important here.
Yes.
I want to kind of round up. We'll try and maybe get through a couple of questions towards the last few minutes in the end. So if anyone's got any questions, I'm sorry I said, you know, I didn't say put them in the chat. Kind of the last thing, maybe tools for investigation. Lawyers have lots of tools for investigations: disclosure orders, search and seizure. I've used, what was it, a genealogist historian who found links to a defendant through their family links in Europe into Germany and Austria, and found assets which weren't disclosed. So we use lots of interesting tools to try and find assets or uncover fraud. What would you say is the one best tool investigative journalists use
to uncover fraud? Winning people's trust.
Well, that's a good one. I like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, seriously. So, well, two things: attention to detail, organizing your information in a chronology. Timelines are simple, but they're powerful. That's my key to how to work. Use a timeline, build your timeline. It doesn't matter how long it gets, and actually, invite other people to contribute to the timeline. Don't compete, collaborate, because you have common cause. That some of the best investigations I've been involved in, things like the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, where you've had a huge leak that no one person could possibly assimilate. Two German journalists who did the original Panama Papers investigation had the brilliant ways of sharing it with other like-minded investigative journalists who would all trust each other, go against commercial incentives, not sort of split off and reveal something, but keep it stum until the launch date and share their research on a secure intranet. That's the new way of doing it. Collaboration enables you to do a lot more than you could if you just were sort of very jealous of every piece of information you have. But mostly winning trust is the answer. Convincing people to talk to you is an interesting business. Obviously I'm BBC, we don't pay people for their information. So how do you motivate them to do something that might be a bit risky? Well, the main way is saying, look, it can't go on like this. You know, it mustn't happen like this. The only way it's going to change is if we have a conversation about it. And the only way that happens is if you give me the information. So trust me, and this can make this come out. And so it's like business, really. It can only work if there's trust. If there's no trust, it just doesn't work.
Kind of ironic, isn't it? We end on trust when the one thing we've talked about is the whole kind of breaking of trust in the financial system. Well, Andy, yes. Thank you so much for giving up your time. Just to mention a few things for everybody before I just try and pick out a couple of questions is we will send a follow-up of the back of this, which we do at the end of every episode within about 1 to 2 weeks, a kind of write-up of the key takeaways and learnings on this. We'll send you links to Andy's book and the podcast and links to previous episodes, which I think Paul and my colleague has been putting in the chat. We also have a questionnaire, which would really just like a feedback form. If you've got a moment, please click on that link and fill it in after the session. It really helps us understand what kind of things people might want to chat to us about or hear about. And lastly, our next episode is on 13th of February at midday with Jane Alimonda, who is an internal auditor that specialises in financial crime and ESG. And it's interesting, ESG in the governance side. We're going to be looking at that with Jane on that day. So let me see if I can quickly pick out some questions, Andy. And for those who can stick around, I appreciate that.
I've got time. I've got time. So
thank you.
Don't feel under pressure.
There have been a load of comments in the chat, so this is where I have to keep clicking on the X. Private criminal prosecution is an option for fraud victims, mainly corporate and the wealthier individual, when the police show no interest. Do you think the concept of non-CPS prosecution has taken a reputational hit following media reporting of the post office scandal? So basically the lack of prosecution through the police and the CPS, now that you're seeing a kind of public driven prosecution, do you think that's damaging trust in prosecuting authorities?
Well, yeah, I mean, the post office was all private prosecutions. I spent a fair bit of the past year looking into all that. But you know, if the post office can undertake private prosecutions, as the lawyers among you will know, individuals are empowered to do the same thing. I mean, I've seen it a lot in the context of small businesses who the system completely fails them. The regulators fail them. They've often lost their businesses, their marriage, their homes, their health, and yet there's no justice. So they turn to private criminal prosecutions, and some lawyers say, yeah, I'll do one of those for you. But I've very rarely seen one that's successful. It seems only to work in the context of a big institution that can fund all the work that's required. You know, so I kind of wish that it were more possible for people to bring private prosecutions, not least because of this decriminalisation effect. When you are a victim of fraud, the police often just don't want to know. They don't have the capacity. So austerity, which was largely caused by the banking crisis, has meant that bankers, for example, can't be pursued by police for fraud, not very easily anyway. There's been so few cases. And when they are, so for example, the HBOS Reading fraud, there was actual criminal convictions there, the people don't get any compensation. So any means that can bring justice, I would hope, can be harnessed, but I'm yet to see it work very well.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I know there's firms out there dealing with private prosecution, and they are getting some good results. I see some charities getting some response, and I know the state then essentially, I think, fund part of that prosecution process. But yeah, it is tough. I know the police have maybe about 1% of their funding dedicated to economic crime, and we know fraud, economic crime is what 38-40% of all issues to society. I fear we could probably talk about all those problems that we need to solve for a lot longer. What I think I'll do, though, is I will wrap it up, because one thing I know about webinars is people like to be away on time. And Andy, thank you very much for just giving up your time on this.
You're most welcome.
I
just want to. You're most welcome, Aaron. It's been fun, and thanks for the kind comments in the chat as well. I just want to invite anybody on this seminar. My direct messages are open. If you've got a story, you can trust us. We're not going to blab things. You can tell us what story you have. If you have a client who wants to go to the media, etc., please don't not approach us. There are other ways of obtaining justice than through the courts or through legal correspondence. One is by having a public conversation, and sometimes that's the only way to change the conversation about a story. So I'm just saying, please do be in touch with us. That's what we're here for. You pay your license fee. I'm a public servant. Get in touch with me.
Yeah, I echo that. I think, get the stories out there and get people to look at them, because sometimes they need to be aired. So, well, thank you everybody who's still on the call. Thank you for making time. And yeah, I'll see you hopefully on the next episode on the 13th of February. Thank you, everyone.